1959. Over the frozen ridges of the Urals, a Soviet radar operator blinks at the screen. A contact has appeared, faint, fast, high, too fast. Within 20 seconds, it's crossed an entire sector. He radios in an alert. Unidentified, high-speed object. West to east trajectory. Speed, Mach 2+. Before the officer's voice can finish echoing down the command channel, the blip is gone. Within 90 seconds, the Soviet radar network loses it entirely. MiG-19 interceptors scramble from a nearby base, roaring off into the stratosphere. But they never get a visual. They never get a radar lock. And worst of all, they never get an explanation. Command in Moscow demands answers. The Air Defense Sector commander has none. His radars caught it. His planes missed it. It was there. And then, it wasn't. What they don't know is that the intruder wasn't a spy plane. It wasn't a missile. It was something far worse. A bomber. The first of its kind. The Convair B-58 Hustler. America's Mach 2 nuclear delivery platform. A delta-winged spear flying higher than Soviet missiles could reach, faster than Soviet jets could chase, and carrying a single, terrifying truth. The Soviet Union was no longer defensible. Designed not for survival but for escape, the B-58 was a machine of velocity. Built with titanium skin and a needle-shaped fuselage, it needed no stealth, no deception. Its defense was simple. Outrun the very concept of interception. The Hustler didn't sneak into enemy airspace. It shattered it. Over the next 5 years, Soviet air defense would launch more than 100 simulated intercept attempts. Every single one failed. Radar crews blamed jamming. Fighter pilots blamed fuel. Commanders blamed outdated flight data. But deep down, all knew the truth. They'd never seen anything move like this, because nothing ever had. The B-58 was no myth. It was no outlier. It was the future arriving early. And for Soviet generals, watching their integrated air defense network unravel before a single bomb had dropped, it marked the beginning of a terrifying realization. In the age of supersonic strike, the old rules no longer applied. In the late 1950 seconds, the Soviet Union stood on what it believed was an unshakable foundation. Its air defense doctrine was built on mass and predictability. Massed formations of bombers would fly predictable paths, and the Soviet military, armed with a vast network of radar stations, interceptor squadrons, and surface-to-air missiles, would simply meet them with overwhelming force. They didn't expect speed to break the system. The legacy of World War II still echoed through Soviet planning rooms. The Red Army had triumphed through numbers, thousands of T-34 seconds, waves of infantry, flak batteries blanketing the skies. Their aircraft, like the Tu-4 bomber, were slow but numerous. Their SAM systems, such as the S-75 Dvina, were lethal but optimized for subsonic targets at altitude. In this worldview, the ideal bomber threat was a lumbering American B-29 or the massive B-36 peacemaker giants that loitered, giving radar crews time to track and target, and interceptors time to climb and engage. The very idea of a bomber outrunning an interceptor was, to most Soviet commanders, absurd. And yet, it was already happening. Across the Atlantic, Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay had begun rewriting the rules. The B-47 had hinted at speed. The B-52 promised altitude and endurance. But the B-58 Hustler would push both beyond theory into combat doctrine. But the Soviets missed the signs. They saw prototypes and dismissed them as experimental curiosities. The few intelligence reports that reached the Kremlin painted the Hustler as fragile, high maintenance, and limited in range. In short, not a serious threat. At worst, it was seen as a niche deterrent, not a fleet designed to deliver nuclear devastation at Mach 2. Their assumptions went deeper. Radar installations across the western USSR were calibrated for known bomber profiles. Their beam sweep speeds, frequency ranges, and altitude sensitivity were based on targets cruising at 35,000 feet at 500 knots. The idea of a bomber screaming in at 60,000 feet and 1,300 miles per hour made those calculations obsolete. But no one recalibrated the system. Fighter squadrons, meanwhile, were flying MiG-17 seconds and early MiG-19 seconds aircraft that could barely intercept a U-2, let alone a Hustler. Climb rates were too slow. Fire control systems were primitive. Worse, the Hustler's high-altitude penetration profile made cannon engagements nearly impossible. Still, Soviet doctrine clung to its comforting myths. If the Americans sent bombers, they would come in waves. They would be slow, and they would be shot down. But what if they came one at a time? What if they were faster than the missiles? What if Soviet defense systems were built for the last war? In sealed briefing rooms across Moscow, no one wanted to ask the question, because no one liked the answer. At Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, inside the heart of Strategic Air Command, a new gospel was being written, one that would fly straight through Soviet defenses before those defenses could even react. General Curtis LeMay had no interest in tradition. He wanted speed. And he wanted American bombers that didn't need escorts, didn't need luck, and didn't need permission to return home safely. The B-58 Hustler was his answer. From its inception, the B-58 was more missile than aircraft. Every line of its sleek delta-wing design served one purpose: outrun anything that might threaten it. While other bombers relied on heavy armor, multiple engines, and defensive gunners, the Hustler ditched it all. It had one defense system: velocity. Its top speed exceeded Mach 2. Its operational ceiling was over 60,000 feet. And in training, it could dash across entire U.S. states in minutes. Unlike the lumbering B-52 seconds, the Hustler struck fast, hit hard, and vanished. Its nuclear payload, carried in an external pod beneath the fuselage, could be dropped with precision and then discarded to reduce drag on the escape. Soviet planners had never imagined such a profile. American doctrine, meanwhile, evolved in real time. The B-58 wasn't just a bomber, it was a symbol. A shift away from saturation raids toward precision, high-speed strikes. In a nuclear scenario, Hustlers would fly alone or in small groups, each one able to deliver a decisive blow against hardened Soviet targets and then disappear before radar tracking could catch up. In the late 50 seconds, U.S. exercises proved the model. Hustlers penetrated simulated Warsaw Pact defenses in NATO drills with ease. Simulated intercepts failed again and again. At Nellis and Edwards Air Force Base, B-58 crews drilled at speeds no Soviet pilot had ever matched. More importantly, every B-58 mission was tied to SAC's expanding command control infrastructure. With mid-air refueling from KC-135 Stratotankers, Hustlers could cross oceans. With upgraded INS systems, they could find targets in complete radio silence. With electronic countermeasure pods, they could scramble enemy radar returns. This wasn't just a new bomber. It was a new theory of war. But to the Soviets, it didn't fit any known pattern. Their own supersonic bomber program, the Tu-22, was plagued with failures, and they assumed the B-58 would follow the same path: overheating engines, unstable aerodynamics, high crash rates. And for a while, it did. The Hustler was expensive, difficult to fly, maintenance heavy, but those were tactical problems. What the Soviets missed was the strategic breakthrough it represented. Because the B-58 wasn't designed to survive Soviet defenses. It was designed to make Soviet defenses irrelevant. And in every flight profile, every training drill, every war game, LeMay's doctrine was proving true. The future of bombing didn't belong to the slow and survivable. It belonged to the fast and untouchable. The first time it happened, Soviet Air Defense Command labeled it a radar malfunction. It was late 1960. A B-58 Hustler on a classified Strategic Air Command test run launched from Carswell Air Force Base, Texas, and executed a simulated penetration profile near the Arctic Circle. The route skirted the edge of Soviet early warning coverage, crossing over Greenland and looping down through the Norwegian Sea just shy of Soviet-controlled airspace near Murmansk. The Hustler's flight plan was no accident. It was designed to test Soviet reaction time and radar resolution in near-contested space without triggering open conflict. At full dash speed, the B-58 crossed the radar detection perimeter in seconds. Soviet radar stations picked up the contact briefly, too briefly. A blip appeared at 65,000 feet, moving at speeds well over Mach 2.7, and then it was gone. Scramble orders were issued. A pair of Mach 21 seconds, launched from Severomorsk, directed to intercept, but the coordinates were already outdated by the time they were airborne. The B-58 was dozens of kilometers away, disappearing into the polar haze. For Soviet commanders, this was inconceivable. They assumed no manned aircraft could maintain such speeds over that distance, especially not while carrying a nuclear payload. But radar logs didn't lie. The trace matched known B-58 telemetry gathered by KGB observers in Western Europe. The Americans had just demonstrated that they could approach Soviet airspace, deliver a simulated payload, and withdraw all in under 20 minutes. It wasn't the only run. Throughout 1961 and 1962, Hustlers repeatedly flew combat profile exercises near the Eastern Bloc's defensive ring. One flight pushed south toward the Black Sea, dipping to treetop altitude before climbing to 50,000 feet over Turkey. Another mimicked a transatlantic strike, rendezvousing with tankers, dashing at full speed over Iceland, and exiting near Greenland, all while Soviet satellites failed to track it in real time. Each mission confirmed the same truth. The B-58's profile couldn't be intercepted under existing Soviet protocols. Surface-to-air missiles lacked the lock-on speed. Fighters couldn't climb or accelerate fast enough. And the window for interception between radar acquisition and weapons engagement was shrinking to seconds. In one particularly revealing war game in 1963, a B-58 team simulated a high-speed strike on a hardened SAM command post in East Germany. The strike succeeded, and post-mission telemetry showed that Soviet defenses hadn't even locked on before the simulated bomb release. This wasn't theory anymore. The impossible had happened, and for Soviet generals, watching from their command bunkers as the world's fastest bomber rendered their decades of defensive planning meaningless, the horror was only beginning. Because if one B-58 could do it, how many more were already en route? The reports landed on the desks of Soviet Air Defense Command with a thud, radar logs, flight traces, electronic warfare signatures, all pointing to one undeniable conclusion. A new American bomber was not only reaching the edges of Soviet airspace, it was doing so faster than anything they had ever faced. But in the corridors of the Ministry of Defense, disbelief reigned. High Command simply couldn't accept the premise. The Politburo had been assured repeatedly that the Soviet Union's integrated air defense network was the most advanced in the world. From the early warning radars near Pskov to the missile fields around Minsk, the system was designed to detect, track, and destroy any hostile aircraft that entered the motherland's skies. Except now, it wasn't working. Initial reports were quietly dismissed as errors: radar malfunction, atmospheric distortion, glitchy signal processors. But the pattern was too consistent. From the Arctic to the Black Sea, the same phenomena kept occurring. A contact appears for less than 30 seconds, traveling at velocities that Soviet radar algorithms struggled to classify. Then, silence. The aircraft was always gone before a MiG could reach its altitude, if it even made it off the ground in time. In internal briefings, commanders labeled the B-58 as an experimental platform with limited combat value. The narrative was simple. It was too fast, too fragile, and too expensive to pose a sustained threat. They cited public American reports about high crash rates and complex maintenance requirements. The Americans won't deploy this in numbers, they said. But behind closed doors, panic was building. A classified KGB technical summary in 1962 warned, if B-58 type aircraft are deployed in squadrons, current Soviet intercept doctrine will not succeed. Estimated kill probability falls below 15% under ideal conditions. Even that estimate was generous. Worse still, the B-58 wasn't behaving like a traditional bomber. Its penetration profile single aircraft, high-speed dashes at extreme altitudes broke every Soviet tracking model. Their entire defense web had been constructed around slow, high-altitude fleets like the B-52. Massive raids, multiple targets, time to coordinate. But the Hustler gave them no time. Commanders who suggested revising doctrine were sidelined. Resources were already committed to the S-200 missile system and the MiG-25 Foxbat, both still years from readiness. Shifting strategy now would mean admitting that existing defenses carefully built over 2 decades were inadequate. Moscow wasn't ready for that admission. So they stalled. They downplayed test data. They redirected intelligence priorities. And they reclassified the B-58 as tactical reconnaissance, a way to explain its speed without acknowledging its strike capability. A convenient lie. But truth doesn't care about politics. And every time a Hustler appeared on Soviet radar, only to vanish seconds later, that lie grew harder to maintain. Because if the Americans could send 1 bomber past the Soviet shield, it meant they could send 10. And Moscow wouldn't even see the war coming. Facing mounting evidence that something was deeply wrong with their interception system, Soviet air defense analysts scrambled for answers. But instead of confronting the real problem, speed, they built a theory that seemed more manageable, more comfortable, more technological. Electronic countermeasures. The Americans, they argued, weren't outpacing Soviet systems, they were blinding them. Radar blips that vanished, clearly jamming, inconsistent trajectories, decoy pods, missed lock-ons, ECM saturation. The theory gained traction fast because it offered a fix. Just upgrade radar filters, develop new waveforms, install better anti-jamming protocols. But none of it addressed the real issue. The B-58 Hustler didn't need to jam radar to survive. It was simply too fast for the existing architecture to react. Still, Soviet engineers poured resources into jamming-resistant upgrades. Signal correlation arrays were installed at major radar sites. New pulse Doppler modes were tested. Anti-radiation missile drills were expanded. The narrative was official now. This was an electronic warfare challenge, not a doctrinal failure. And yet, results didn't change. Even with upgraded radar protocols, B-58 overflight drills showed the same pattern. Detect, track, lose. In one simulation near the Kola Peninsula, 3 separate radar installations picked up a Hustler at 66,000 feet, but none could maintain lock for longer than 8 seconds. The bomber was covering 15 miles per minute. Engagement cycles simply couldn't keep up. The ECM theory started to crack. Frustrated technicians began whispering what they weren't allowed to say publicly. We're not being jammed. We're being outrun. But command held the line. They launched new studies, commissioned reports, added more radar sites, more handoff nodes between stations. The system grew in complexity but not in effectiveness. At the center of it all was the S-75 Dvina missile system. Celebrated for its success against the U-2 inches 1,960. It had become a symbol of Soviet air dominance. But against the B-58, it was obsolete. The Dvina required sustained tracking data to calculate a fire solution. At Mach 2, the Hustler left the tracking envelope before the Dvina even finished its launch sequence. Instead of admitting defeat, Soviet engineers tweaked the margins. They boosted radar output, shortened response time protocols, but none of it changed the reality. They were solving the wrong problem. Because it wasn't jamming that made the B-58 untouchable. It was time. The bomber moved faster than their systems could think. It erased the interval between detection and destruction. And in that interval, Soviet defenses found only silence. No lock-on, no interception, No second chances. If it wasn't jamming, Soviet planners reasoned, then perhaps the B-58 was only dangerous because of its unpredictability. Not its speed, but its route. Perhaps the solution wasn't in intercepting it mid-flight, but in waiting for it to arrive at its destination. Thus was born the second wrong theory. Predictive intercept. Instead of chasing the Hustler through the sky, Soviet defense networks would use predictive algorithms, triangulated radar picks, and satellite intelligence to anticipate where the B-58 would be. Then, they'd station interceptors and SAM batteries in those zones to ambush it as it crossed into reach. On paper, it was sound. If a Hustler had to hit strategic targets, missile silos, command bunkers, airfields, it had to follow a logical path. And every path, no matter how fast, had to pass through someone's airspace. Interceptors could pre-launch. Missiles could pre-lock. The Americans, they hoped, could be met before the attack ever arrived. But this theory, too, collapsed because the B-58 didn't fly like a bomber. Unlike the B-52, the Hustler didn't lumber toward its target on a steady cruise path. It executed a low-level ingress, then performed a rapid pop-up maneuver to high altitude for release, followed by an immediate supersonic dash to egress. By the time Soviet analysts had extrapolated one intercept vector, the Hustler was already hundreds of kilometers away, climbing, diving, jinking, and accelerating. Worse, the aircraft's INS, inertial navigation system, allowed precise autonomous guidance, meaning no radio signals, no emissions, and no hints to ground radar of where it was going. Some B-58 runs even included dummy vectoring, a maneuver where the bomber would simulate one flight path before abruptly shifting course, throwing off any pre-positioned Soviet intercept attempt. In a 1964 Red Banner Fleet exercise, Soviet interceptors stationed over eastern Belarus were tasked with a predictive lock on a B-58 approaching from the Baltic corridor. They waited. They launched early, and they failed. The Hustler never came. It had looped in through a different corridor entirely at twice the estimated approach speed and completed its simulated run before the MiGs were even halfway to altitude. In the post-mission analysis, one colonel summed it up bitterly. "We predicted the route perfectly just for the wrong moment in time." This was the heart of the problem. The Soviet air defense network was static, rigid. It needed time to adjust, to plan, to triangulate. The B-58 gave it none. Its raw velocity turned every engagement window into a coin flip, and most of the time, that coin never even got tossed. And so, the second wrong theory collapsed, just like the first, because speed was the strategy, and the moment the Hustler appeared on radar, it was already gone. Inside the Lubyanka, headquarters of the KGB, senior intelligence officers pored over reels of intercepted telemetry, satellite images, and human intelligence. They had spent years monitoring American bomber developments, from the slow rise of the B-52 to the cancellation of the XB-70 Valkyrie. But with the B-58 Hustler, they had missed something more fundamental than a plane. They had missed a paradigm shift. KGB aerospace analysts had known about the Hustler as early as 1957. Its debut at Carswell Air Force Base, though classified in detail, was not invisible to Soviet eyes. But internal assessments minimized its threat. Reports described it as an expensive stunt, too fast for conventional bombing, too vulnerable to sustain losses, and too limited in range to pose strategic danger without tanker support. Worse, those assumptions were fed directly into Soviet defense planning. Declassified notes from a 1961 GRU briefing labeled the B-58 as a tactical asset rather than a strategic threat. Its speed was acknowledged, but dismissed as unsustainable in combat. Fuel limits, engine stress, maintenance, complexity. Those were the comforts Moscow clung to. Meanwhile, CIA operatives embedded within Warsaw Pact air units fed back detailed information. Soviet air regiments had no coordinated protocol for intercepting Mach 2 bombers. Radar tracking drills consistently failed to maintain contact. Air defense sectors hesitated to report lapses, fearing reprimands. Some faked successful intercept reports entirely. On the American side, Strategic Air Command quietly escalated training for B-58 crews. Combat missions were simulated in Arctic environments. Jamming pods were tested. Tanker rendezvous in contested zones were rehearsed. And the U.S. intelligence community, using reconnaissance satellites and SIGINT intercepts, identified critical weaknesses in Soviet response timing, particularly in the radar handoff protocols between Eastern and Central Command zones. Those delays became targets. By 1964, B-58 simulations showed that in a nuclear scenario, hustlers could strike 12 major Soviet command facilities with over 60% survivability without stealth. The speed alone was enough to ensure delivery and escape, but Soviet leadership never saw the full picture. Bureaucratic inertia, ideological pride, and factional infighting within the Ministry of Defense all worked against recognition. Reports were filtered, warnings were downplayed. One defector later stated, "Our greatest failure was not our radar. It was our ego." In retrospect, the evidence had been overwhelming, but the B-58 broke more than Soviet radar. It broke their model of warfare. The belief that mass defenses could halt even the fastest threat. The faith in structured zones of denial. The myth of impenetrability. It was all gone. And by the time Soviet intelligence realized the full scope of the hustlers' capabilities, the damage was irreversible. They weren't facing a new aircraft. They were facing a new reality. It wasn't the B-58 hustler alone that terrified Soviet planners. It was the ecosystem behind it. The jet was fast, but it was what surrounded that speed that made it truly unstoppable. At the core was Strategic Air Command, a machine of ruthless precision. Every B-58 flight wasn't just a pilot and a plane. It was the result of 1,000 interlocking parts, navigation systems, electronic warfare pods, in-flight refueling corridors, global communications links, and, most importantly, doctrine. American air power had evolved beyond the Cold War model of brute force. It was no longer about launching waves of bombers and saturating Soviet skies with payloads. It was about speed, accuracy, and coordination. A surgical system designed to win wars in the opening minutes. The hustler was its spear point. Each B-58 crew was hand-picked from the elite. Pilots, navigators, and defensive systems officers trained for years to master a flight profile that left no room for error. Flying at Mach 2 at 60,000 feet was not a stunt, it was a standard. Reaction times had to be instantaneous. Evasion maneuvers were memorized to the second. And every movement, from throttle push to bomb release, was drilled until it became instinct. But they weren't flying alone. High above them, the U.S. maintained a constellation of early warning satellites. Along the world's oceans, radar picket ships and airborne early warning aircraft scanned for Soviet movement. Tankers, like the KC-135 Stratotanker, were pre-positioned across global corridors, enabling the hustlers' limited range to be stretched into continent-crushing reach. Behind them, command centers like NORAD and SAC headquarters coordinated strike profiles in real time. If a target moved, so did the plan. If a route was compromised, the system recalculated. While Soviet air defense was centralized and rigid, the American response network was modular, adaptive, and built for redundancy. Even the hustlers perceived weaknesses. Its maintenance load, fuel consumption, and payload limitations were calculated trade-offs. It didn't need to carry a dozen bombs. It only needed one. A single thermonuclear warhead, delivered at Mach 2, was enough to erase a hardened Soviet missile silo or command bunker. And then it would vanish before the defense system even knew it had been there. Worse still, the hustler wasn't alone. It was part of a strike family paired with high-altitude reconnaissance flights, electronic warfare aircraft, and B-52 formations flying offset routes as decoys. Soviet radar crews might scramble to intercept a slower, easier target only to realize too late that the real strike had already passed. This wasn't improvisation. It was doctrine. General Curtis LeMay's vision had materialized. A force that didn't just reach the enemy, it erased their ability to respond. Every American crewman, radar operator, and planner knew their role in the dance. They rehearsed it weekly. They trusted it absolutely. And the Soviet Union, with its vast but inflexible systems, couldn't keep up. Because America hadn't just built a fast bomber, it had built a war machine that moved faster than thought. It happened during a NATO exercise in the spring of 1965, an event known internally within SAC as Operation Iron Dagger. Though publicly labeled a multi-aircraft readiness test, its real purpose was more pointed. Simulate a full-speed B-58 penetration run against Warsaw-packed airspace and prove beyond debate that Soviet defenses couldn't stop it. And they couldn't. 4 B-58 Hustlers launched from RAF Mildenhall in the UK, each with full electronic countermeasure pods, dummy payloads, and a detailed strike route calculated to thread between known radar sites. Their goal was audacious. Simulate a deep strike into Polish territory, destroy a hardened Soviet missile installation, and egress before a single effective counter could be mounted. From the first minute, it was a rout. Soviet radar in Kaliningrad detected the Hustlers briefly. They scrambled MiG 21 seconds, but by the time the interceptors reached operational altitude, the B-58 seconds were already 200 kilometers downrange, flying at Mach 2.1. Surface-to-air missile crews tracked the blips, but couldn't achieve lock fast enough to launch. Over East Germany, Soviet-aligned radar arrays attempted to coordinate a handoff. It failed. The Hustlers had covered the distance before the targeting data could be relayed. Polish intercept squadrons were caught flat-footed, with several aircraft still on the tarmac when the strike was completed. In under 20 minutes, the lead Hustler had simulated the release of a nuclear payload and begun egress. Not one was intercepted. Not one was tracked to completion. And Soviet command was watching. Though the U.S. never publicly acknowledged the exercise's deeper intent, Soviet analysts were under no illusions. They dissected telemetry. They traced the electronic warfare signatures. They measured the radar anomalies and correlated them with the Hustlers' known performance. The conclusion was damning. Our current system cannot stop these aircraft. The humiliation didn't stop there. A classified intercept transcript revealed that one Soviet ground controller, overwhelmed by failed radar locks, screamed over open comms, "The bomber is a ghost. It crosses borders and leaves no shadow." Another commander, in a post-action briefing, bitterly remarked, "We have built a wall. The Americans have simply decided not to walk through the door, but fly over it at the speed of thunder." The aftermath was immediate. Emergency programs were initiated. Research into new high-speed interceptors accelerated. The MiG-25 Foxbat was fast-tracked. SAM network upgrades were rushed to the front. But everyone knew these were stopgaps. The problem wasn't just hardware. It was conceptual. Soviet generals realized too late that the B-58 Hustler had revealed a fatal flaw. Their air defense network wasn't built to fight speed, it was built to fight mass. To stop swarms, not specters. And in Iron Dagger's wake, one painful truth hung over every Kremlin war room. The Americans had already won the first engagement, without firing a single shot. By the end of 1965, the illusion of Soviet airspace invulnerability had shattered. The B-58 Hustler didn't just expose weaknesses in radar or missile coverage, it invalidated an entire doctrine of defense. And in doing so, it forced the Soviet Union to confront a more terrifying question. What if the Americans could reach any target, at any time, and Moscow would never even know it was coming? That thought terrified more than generals. It humiliated the ideological foundation of the Soviet system, one that championed technological superiority, the shield of the motherland, the unbreakable ring of steel around socialism. The B-58 sliced through that mythology at Mach 2. Inside the Kremlin, fear metastasized into paralysis. How do you fight a weapon you can't track? How do you intercept a threat that disappears between radar pulses? How do you rally troops, plot strategy, or issue commands when the warhead has already hit before the order can be given? The B-58 wasn't meant to win a dogfight. It was designed to prevent one. The USSR began diverting billions to desperate catch-up projects. New radar bands, hypersonic intercept research, more satellites. The MiG-25 was rushed into service with record speed, not because it was ready, but because something had to be done. Anything. But none of these efforts addressed the deeper crisis: reaction time. Every Soviet solution required anticipation, but the Hustler gave no warning. It rendered the concept of response obsolete, and in doing so, it forced Soviet leaders to rethink the very structure of their war plans. Massive mobilizations? Too slow. Interceptor swarms? Too late. Static defenses? Already bypassed. The ideological damage was even worse. For decades, the USSR had projected strength through rigidity. Walls, borders, checkpoints, overlapping security rings. But the Hustler's doctrine was mobility, precision, unpredictability. It was the exact opposite of Soviet war theory. And it worked. One Soviet strategist, in a rare moment of candor during a closed-door session, admitted, "We are not fighting the American Air Force. We are fighting American time." He wasn't wrong. The B-58's very existence forced Soviet planners to consider the unthinkable, that the next war might begin and end within 30 minutes without a single pilot ever being intercepted, without a single radar ever finishing its sweep. The Hustler was eventually phased out by the early 1970 seconds, but its legacy endured. It had changed the battlefield forever, not by its kill count, but by its implications, and for the Soviet command structure, that shift wasn't just military, it was existential. Decades after the B-58 Hustler retired from active service, its legend still haunted the air defense halls of Russia's military academies. Not for its longevity, it only flew operationally for a decade, but for what it revealed. Its brief reign had exposed something no missile could destroy: the brittle core of Cold War certainty. In the modern age, stealth and satellites dominate headlines. Drones cross continents, bombers circle the globe, and hypersonic weapons threaten to collapse warning windows even further. But long before the B-2 or the F-22, the B-58 had already asked the question every strategist dreads. What if the enemy simply moves faster than your entire system? That question still echoes in Moscow. Veterans of the old radar crews, now gray and retired, still speak of the phantom blip days when their screens would flash, then go blank, leaving behind nothing but panic and silence. They remember the drills that always failed, the intercepts that never came close, the blinding speed that turned defenses into theater. Today, historians remember the Hustler as a stepping stone overshadowed by newer technology, folded into the narrative of aviation's march. But for those who lived under its shadow, it was something else entirely. A ghost, a reminder that victory in the Cold War didn't always come from firepower. Sometimes, it came from moving too fast to be seen, from training harder, thinking sharper, acting quicker. The Soviet Union collapsed a generation later, not because of one bomber, but because of 1,000 moments just like it. Moments where their systems froze, their doctrines broke, and their illusions of control vanished in a sonic boom. And in one of those moments, somewhere near the edge of contested airspace, a radar crew stared at an empty screen. They never saw the Hustler again. It had already come and gone.